The ground in the Sahel region is unforgiving. It is a harsh, relentless landscape where the sun beats down with brutal force, baking the earth until it cracks into a million dry, dusty puzzle pieces. For generations, this intense sun was seen strictly as a harsh reality, a punishing force of nature that dictated whether a family would eat or starve during the long, dry seasons. Men would stand in their barren fields, looking up at a cloudless, unforgiving sky, praying for rain that rarely came on time. But today, under that exact same blazing sky, a quiet revolution is taking root. An 18-year-old boy sits in the red dust, his hands moving with quiet, deliberate speed over a complicated tangle of copper wires. He's not looking up at the sky in despair, waiting for the weather to change. He is looking down at a mechanical solution. He is not waiting for a foreign aid truck to arrive bearing imported bags of grain. He is not waiting for a government handout or a charitable donation from a massive Western non-governmental organization. Instead, he has scoured the local markets and gathered old, discarded solar panels from a scrapyard, meticulously piecing them together with salvaged water motors, worn-out car batteries, and simple, cheap plastic pipes. With unwavering focus and natural engineering skill, he twists the final wire into place, securing it tightly with a frayed piece of electrical tape. A low, steady hum begins to vibrate through the plastic tube running deep into the ground. Suddenly, a thick stream of clear, cold water bursts out, soaking the dry soil, instantly turning the choking dust into rich, dark mud. In that single, profoundly quiet moment, this young man has done vastly more than simply water his village's small crop of vegetables. He has built a localized weapon of profound economic liberation. He has tapped directly into an infinite energy source that no foreign corporation can ever tax, regulate, audit, or suddenly turn off. If this story matters for Africa, press-like so, more people see it. While this young man was building his independent solar pump in the dirt, groups of men in expensive tailored suits were sitting in climate-controlled boardrooms in distant European capitals, looking at complex financial spreadsheets and making cold, detached calculations about the future of Burkina Faso. These European energy corporations, backed by decades of neo-colonial agreements, held the absolute keys to the traditional, centralized power grid of the African nation. For a very long time, they have operated under a remarkably simple and utterly ruthless geopolitical logic. They own the spinning turbines, they own the high-tension wires, and they own the distribution hubs, which means they fundamentally control the economic lifeblood of the nation itself. Whenever African leaders attempted to assert their true independence in the past, these corporations simply tightened the economic leash. But when the political winds shifted drastically in Ouagadougou, when Ibrahim Traore stood up and demanded total, uncompromising sovereignty over the resources and infrastructure of his country, these corporate executives decided it was time to use their ultimate leverage. They threatened to plunge the entire nation into literal darkness. They threatened to systematically cut the power supply, halt all necessary mechanical maintenance on the aging grid, and immediately freeze every single dollar of new infrastructure investment. They wanted to create immediate, unbearable economic pain in the streets. They wanted to remind the newly defiant people of Burkina Faso exactly who held the real, tangible power over their daily lives. It was a classic, heavy-handed display of centralized authority, an economic siege tactic designed specifically to force a sovereign, proud nation to its knees and make them beg for mercy. They truly believed that without their imported electricity, the African revolution for self-reliance would simply grind to a miserable halt. But what happens when a nation collectively decides that the sun belongs to absolutely no one, and that their future will no longer be held hostage by foreign men operating foreign switches? The European energy ultimatum was delivered clearly, and it echoed loudly through the halls of international finance and global diplomacy. The underlying message sent to the government in Ouagadougou was that without the continued grace, funding, and technological superiority of Western energy corporations, the entire fragile economy of Burkina Faso would collapse in a matter of mere weeks. The factories would stop producing, the hospitals would go dark, and the crucial agricultural sector would wither and die under the hot sun. Western diplomats and financial analysts in Washington and Paris expected immediate, chaotic panic. They fully expected the transitional government to quickly backtrack on its bold declarations, to issue public apologies, to offer massive corporate tax concessions, and to beg for the power grid to remain operational at any cost. That is exactly how the diplomatic game of leverage has always been played across the African continent for the last 60 years. But President Ibrahim Traore did not panic, and he certainly did not beg for relief. Instead, he met their aggressive threats with a profound, impenetrable silence that must have been deeply unsettling to those distant corporate boardrooms. Traore and his circle of advisors understood a fundamental truth about modern geopolitical power that the West constantly tries to obscure. Centralized power grids, built and maintained by high-interest foreign loans and operated by foreign corporations, are not actual engines of national development. They are elaborate, highly profitable traps. When a nation relies entirely on a massive, foreign-owned power plant located hundreds of miles away, that nation is simply renting its sovereignty on a month-to-month basis. Recognizing this fatal vulnerability, Traore launched a strategic, decentralized counteroffensive that absolutely no one in the Western intelligence community saw coming. He did not attempt to negotiate for a new, slightly better power plant deal. He decided to boldly bypass their entire archaic system of control. The government of Burkina Faso announced the immediate nationwide deployment of 10,000 solar micropumps directly to the farming communities. They called this unprecedented, massive initiative the Desert Grid. It was, in its purest, most potent form, an off-the-grid revolution. This is a powerful concept that strikes a deep, resonant chord with anyone who values extreme self-reliance, rugged individualism, and the burning desire to be completely free from centralized corporate control, a sentiment intimately understood by many rural Americans. Instead of maintaining one massive, vulnerable target that a foreign entity could easily manipulate, embargo, or shut down at will, Burkina Faso would build 10,000 independent, completely self-sustaining nodes of life and agricultural production. The national government provided the initial heavy hardware, the basic solar panels, and the imported water pumps, but it was the local people themselves, the generational farmers, the young, self-taught engineers, the village cooperative councils who took absolute, fiercely proud ownership of the project. They completely bypassed the European-controlled national electricity grid, rendering it irrelevant to their survival. When the official announcement was made, Western economic analysts in London and Paris openly scoffed. They went on global financial news networks and laughed at the initiative, calling it a desperate, impossible political stunt designed merely to distract the angry population from the impending blackouts. They published lengthy, highly technical, and deeply condescending reports stating that a decentralized agricultural network of this massive scale was logistically impossible for a developing nation currently operating under heavy international sanctions. They openly mocked the idea that basic solar panels and local African ingenuity could ever replace billions of dollars of sophisticated European infrastructure and engineering. They sat back comfortably in their pristine offices and waited for the inevitable, spectacular failure, confidently predicting that the vital crops would soon wither in the intense heat, and that the starving, desperate people would ultimately turn their anger against their own leadership. But how could a country entirely under economic siege manage to turn its harshest, most unforgiving desert environment into an unstoppable engine of mass independence? The tension across the entire Sahel region reached a dangerous, palpable breaking point as the unforgiving dry season rapidly approached its absolute peak. European diplomats, working in close tandem with massive international financial institutions, began issuing dark, veiled warnings through the global corporate press. They aggressively hinted that the agricultural sector of Burkina Faso was teetering on the absolute brink of a catastrophic, man-made famine. They were so utterly confident in their legacy system of centralized corporate control that they literally could not imagine a functional, grassroots alternative. They truly believed that the fundamental human right to grow food required their explicit permission, their high-interest financing, and their proprietary technology. They escalated their aggressive rhetoric, even threatening to bring the issue before the World Trade Organization, absurdly claiming that Burkina Faso was somehow violating international trade contracts by actively encouraging its own citizens to abandon the centralized grid. They tried everything in their vast diplomatic arsenal to create a paralyzing climate of fear. But on the ground, in Burkina Faso, across the vast, sun-baked expanses of the Sahel, there was absolutely no panic to be found. There was no chaos, no rioting in the streets, and no fear of the dark. There was only the calm, steady, unrelenting rhythm of collective, purposeful work. Thousands of young people, deeply inspired by the exact same spirit as the 18-year-old boy who started with salvaged scrap parts, were actively mobilizing across every single province. They were not sitting around waiting for orders from the capital. They were independently setting up gleaming solar panels in the red dirt, digging miles of vital irrigation trenches entirely by hand, and connecting countless thick hoses to the newly installed micropumps. The African response to Western economic threats was not a loud, angry political protest in the streets or a desperate plea at the United Nations. It was the quiet, methodical, hyper-efficient application of basic science, local knowledge, and massive community organization. In the face of overwhelming, crushing international pressure, their calm focus was their ultimate, unbreakable power. They understood perfectly well that chaos and panic are exactly what the enemy desires. And then, after weeks of silent, grueling preparation, the definitive day of reckoning finally arrived. Across the entire nation, as the brilliant morning sun rose high over the vast Sahel, 10,000 individual electrical switches were flipped by 10,000 individual, independent farmers. There was no grand, televised ribbon-cutting ceremony in a European capital. There was only the collective, incredibly powerful hum of 10,000 water motors coming to life all at the exact same time. Water, drawn directly from the deep hidden aquifers of the earth using the infinite, entirely free power of the sun, began to flow aggressively across thousands upon thousands of acres of previously barren, cracked land. The dusty desert literally began to turn a vibrant, shocking green before their very eyes. The national harvest was not just barely saved from total ruin, it was actively breaking historical production records right in the absolute middle of the harshest dry season in recent memory. Tell me what you think about this. Comment your honest take. The European energy boardrooms, once so loud with arrogant threats, ultimatums, and mockery, fell completely and utterly silent. Their greatest geopolitical leverage, their ultimate weapon of control, had completely evaporated into the hot African air. They had arrogantly tried to turn off the lights to teach Africa a brutal lesson in obedience, but the people of Burkina Faso had simply reached up and captured the immense power of the sun. The hard-working citizens of this proud nation had decisively proven to the entire world that true, lasting economic independence does not require begging for foreign infrastructure or accepting predatory, multi-generational loans. It only requires the immense courage to build your own reality from the ground up. If the traditional powers of the world can no longer control the electricity, the water, and the food, how can they ever possibly hope to control the people? The visual transformation inside the borders of Burkina Faso was immediate, profound, and utterly undeniable to anyone walking through the local markets. During a season when the stalls are traditionally bare, when the harsh, dry winds normally force the price of imported staple goods to skyrocket beyond the reach of the average citizen, something entirely unprecedented was happening. The massive open-air markets in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso were absolutely overflowing with fresh, locally grown produce. Mountains of bright red tomatoes, crisp green vegetables, and heavy sacks of newly harvested grain were being traded freely and proudly. This was not food that had been loaded onto massive cargo ships in Europe or the United States, shipped across the ocean, and then sold at a massive premium to a captive, desperate population. This was food pulled directly from their own sovereign soil, nourished by their own underground water, and powered by the free, unmetered energy of the African sun. The economic ripple effect of this massive agricultural surge was staggering. Because the farmers no longer had to pay exorbitant, fluctuating prices for imported European electricity to run their irrigation systems, their operational costs plummeted. They were keeping the profits of their own hard labor within their own communities. Small rural villages that had lived in a perpetual state of crushing debt for decades suddenly found themselves possessing actual, tangible wealth. They began building new brick schools for their children, repairing their own local roads without waiting for a national government contract, and creating a vibrant, self-sustaining microeconomy that was completely insulated from the volatile, heavily manipulated global financial markets. But the true impact of the desert grid was far greater than just the domestic economic boom. The psychological shift was tectonic. The people of Burkina Faso looked at the 10,000 solar pumps operating flawlessly across their nation and realized that the great, terrifying myth of Western indispensability was exactly that, a carefully constructed myth. They realized they did not actually need foreign corporate giants to survive. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news. This dangerous realization, this infectious spirit of extreme self-reliance, could not be contained within the borders of a single nation. The news of the agricultural miracle in Burkina Faso spread like wildfire across the entire Sahel region. The neighboring allied nations within the Alliance of Sahel States, specifically Mali and Niger, did not send traditional diplomats in expensive suits to investigate the situation. They sent their best young engineers, their most dedicated agricultural scientists, and their military logistics experts. They crossed the borders, stood in the muddy green fields of Burkina Faso, and studied the simple, brilliant architecture of the decentralized solar networks. They immediately recognized that this was not just a clever farming technique, it was a highly effective template for absolute national security. Mali and Niger, both facing similar threats of economic warfare and infrastructure sabotage from hostile Western powers, began actively planning their own massive decentralized grids. They understood that a centralized power plant is a massive vulnerability, a single target that can be sanctioned, blockaded, or destroyed. But 10,000 independent solar farms spread across millions of acres of harsh desert are completely impossible for any foreign power to effectively control or shut down. This regional awakening sent absolute shockwaves through the elite financial districts of the Western world. The profound concern in Washington, London, and Paris was no longer just about losing a few lucrative energy contracts in West Africa. The genuine, deep-seated panic stemmed from the terrifying realization that they were rapidly losing their entire blueprint of global control. For over half a century, the primary mechanism for maintaining dominance over the global south was the monopoly on massive, critical infrastructure. If a developing nation wanted lights, water, or paved roads, they had to accept predatory loans from the International Monetary Fund, adhere to strict political conditions, and hire Western megacorporations to build and manage the centralized systems. But if African nations could simply bypass this entire exploitative architecture, if they could independently harvest the sun and pump their own water using cheap, accessible technology and local ingenuity, then the absolute leverage of the Western financial system would simply evaporate. Countries across South America and Southeast Asia were watching this African defiance closely, taking detailed notes on how a heavily sanctioned, supposedly isolated nation was completely outsmarting the most powerful economic institutions on the planet. If the resilient people of the Sahel can successfully secure their own food, water, and energy without seeking Western approval or accepting Western debt, what critical industry will they logically take back next? We must be entirely clear-eyed about what this historic moment truly represents in the broader context of global geopolitics. The desert grid is not merely a successful agricultural initiative or a clever technological workaround. It is a profound, monumental act of psychological liberation. For generations, the dominant global narrative relentlessly insisted that the African continent was fundamentally broken, inherently dependent, and completely incapable of basic self-management without the guiding, heavy hand of the West. The foreign aid model was consistently presented to the world as an act of noble charity, when in reality it functioned as a highly sophisticated mechanism for permanent, inescapable control. By cutting the cord to the European grid and building their own sovereign network from the ground up, the people of Burkina Faso did not just grow food. They aggressively reclaimed their own historical narrative. They proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that dependency is not a natural condition. It is an artificially imposed system that can be violently dismantled through unity, discipline, and sheer willpower. However, it is absolutely critical to understand that the entrenched global power structures will not simply surrender their historic dominance quietly. They will not graciously accept this massive loss of leverage and influence over the African continent. The pressure will inevitably return, and it will be severe. The financial institutions will likely attempt to weaponize the World Trade Organization, creating new, complex regulations specifically designed to penalize independent, decentralized farming networks. They may attempt to severely restrict the global supply chain of essential solar panel components, or aggressively fund internal proxy opposition groups to actively sabotage the new infrastructure. The economic war for true African sovereignty is far from over. It has merely entered a new, highly unpredictable, and significantly more dangerous phase. But there is a fundamental, undeniable difference in the atmosphere today. The traditional fear that used to paralyze African leadership is completely gone. The people are deeply satisfied, profoundly aware of their own strength, and remarkably prepared for whatever the global empire throws at them next. They have tasted the sweet, undeniable reality of true independence, and they will never willingly return to the suffocating darkness of foreign control. Deep in the rural heart of the country, far away from the noisy political debates of the capital, an old grandfather sat quietly in the shade of a large tree. He watched intently as his young grandson carefully wiped the fine red dust off a gleaming solar panel that powered the village well. For his entire long life, this old man had been conditioned to look up at the sky and pray for rain, or to look down the long, dusty road and wait for a foreign aid truck to arrive. He had lived his life at the absolute mercy of forces he could not control, but as he watched the clear, cold water gush from the pipe, entirely driven by the mechanism his own family maintained, his eyes filled with a quiet, fierce pride. He pulled the boy close and told him that for the first time in their family's history, their survival was not a gift from a distant, unknown master. It was a victory forged by their own hands. This is the unbreakable spirit that currently terrifies the old global order. When a people fundamentally realize that they hold the power to sustain their own lives, the chains of empire simply dissolve into dust. Press, like if dignity and justice still mean something to you. What happens to the masters of the world when the people they seek to rule finally realize they do not need them at all?